So I greet you, and wherever you are, I greet you. And I have taken it upon myself to always acknowledge the invisible, or to never begin marching into the familiar without acknowledging that the familiar is subsidized by that which has been excluded, the invisible. And so I'm only here speaking to you and speaking with you and participating in this altar building process with you today because my wife, my children, my mothers have allowed it to be, my ancestors have allowed it to be. There's a lot of suffering going on here in India, as you might have heard. Well, no, it's not just India, it's everywhere in the world. There's loss and grief, woven with joy and trepidation and hope and prayers and yearning and longing. There's a lot of things happening. And I just wanted to start us out on a conversation around that, if to bring us in, if you will. The invitation is this: to what's it like where you are? What does touch mean to you at this point in time, when touch is this electrifying proposal? Don't touch anyone. Social distancing, keep away. Touch is now real, like it's no longer by the way or normal or conventional. It's now a thing. So how are you keeping in touch, and what does touch mean to you in these times? I think touch has always been orgasmic, has always been sensuous, has always been electrifying. Modernity has a way of numbing us or deadening our entanglements with each other. It has a way of normalizing the electrifying, the sacred, or making it distance, a matter of distance. But something about transversal visitations, which is one way to frame a virus bursting into the framework of the modern. Something about the transversal crystallizes what was always there, but was just slightly dormant. And now the things that are that were maybe sleeping are now awakening, if you will. And the powerful potency of being in touch with a house, with being in touch with a lost one, with the entanglements and the relationships we already have with strangers are coming alive, if you will. So that's one thing to note. I come from a tradition that valorizes and celebrates touch, that has a greeting for every moment. The Yoruba people of Nigeria. And so this is at once new to me and almost ancient at the same time. So I welcome you with that. It's a good question to keep on asking each other. What are you constantly being reminded of? What are you now in touch with? Instead of just how are you or hello. I think maybe at this time we need to generate fugitive kinds of greetings so we can meet each other as if for the first time. I'd like us to do a quick exercise just to move things along. And this will involve paper and pencil or pen. And it's just to do some writing. Don't write a book, just in response to 3 prompts. And yeah. So what I would be inviting us to do is to share a story about this time. And it could be 2 lines per prompt, or a small paragraph of 3 sentences, or 1 sentence, whatever you feel inspired to do. The prompt is to tell the story of the coronavirus and how you're meeting this moment. What's the story of this moment for you? What's the story of all what we're going through collectively? if you will, as a species, as an earth-based collective? What is the story of this moment? And I want to break it down. It doesn't have to be structured this way, but I think for our purposes, I just did it this way. It's in 3 parts. The first prompt is you continue this sentence. It all began this way. It all began this way. And then you add your own sentences to that. Whatever you feel like. The second part of this is the middle, if you will. Eventually, ... Eventually. And then the end is finally. The third act. How did it end? If it does end, whatever endings mean to you, you have every liberty and you have my permission to jettison the entire the prompts and do something that is in response in a way that feels comfortable for you. So it all began this way, eventually, and then we have finally. So I'll just give us 3 minutes or 2 minutes each for each prompt. That should take us 5 minutes or 6 minutes, and we can start. We can do it. It all began this way. Blah, 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 blah. Eventually, finally. Okay, we'll have just 1 more minute. I think our novels can start getting published. It all began this way, eventually, finally. Okay. Welcome back. On the streets of Chennai, where I live, there are many funny names that they give to the coronavirus. I've heard some call it Karuna. Some even say Carolina. they give the virus different funny names, and sometimes I feel people want to jump in and say, no, that's the wrong thing to say. You ought to say coronavirus. And you're missing the point, I think. That the way people story their worlds are strategies of meeting the intelligible or the unintelligible. It's a strategy for making it a little bit more graspable. And that's for all stories. That's what stories do. A story is a strategy for visualizing things that are otherwise invisible. It's a way for calling into being the unintelligible, the promiscuous, if you will, and putting it in a family way is another way to frame that. You might ask which one's the right story and which one's the true or the false one. And that would be to insert another kind of story with other kinds of presumptions and assumptions about the nature of truth in it. We're not going to go there. But what I want to share at this point is how stories are like anticipations. They're anticipatory organic movements that allow us to position ourselves in a world that is complex, complicated, entangled, and entangling. And it becomes difficult to move in a world without a storied connection with it. So we're all connected in some form, in some strategic form with what's happening in the world today. Some of us might see this as the universe calling us into a place of being with it. And all of us might have different stories that we share about this time. And that's fine. The point here is not only do stories act as modes of anticipation, as organic modes of meeting the unintelligible, they sometimes trap us and incarcerate us in their algorithms. That is to say that stories are not just tools for seeing. Stories quickly become jails, prisons that trap us in their bodies. And we become not just the people who write stories, but we become the written. We become the tools of stories. It's just like what people ask today. I read a paper that said that there are small microevolutionary changes that are happening to us as a result of our constant use of phones. It might be inescapable, might be invisible to us on an everyday level, but at molecular scales, we are changing. And in a sense, it's not just biologically, not as if the biological could be separate from the psychological, but even at emotional, affective levels, we are doing the work that our phones tell us to do. We are performing emotional labor for Facebook. We get happy when we see a notification in our Facebook, pages. I mean, is there anyone that doesn't have a Facebook page here? Everyone does, I reckon. How many of you really be honest? How many of you feel happy when you you get liked. A post of yours gets liked by everyone I know. For most of us, we get happy. Our post has been liked. It's some form of social affirmation. And so we're performing some kind of emotional labor. It's not just that Facebook and social networks are tools, technologies of ours. It's that we are technologies of these social networks. We're being used in some ways so that the primary distinction between the user and the technology is broken down. And this is what it means to live in a non-dual entangling universe, where technology is the tool, or the tool is the user, and the user is the tool at the same time. In the same way, stories use us. They perpetuate themselves. They spread mimetic iterations of themselves. They seed themselves through assumptions, through patterns of seeing. They hide in invisible ways, and they hide behind our blind spots so that we stop seeing them altogether. And we just think we're seeing the natural world as it is, not knowing or not realizing that we are living in the guts. We've become part of the microbiome, the gut bacteria world and cosmology and ecology of a story. And this can be dangerous, to live in the belly of a story. It has risks. It affords us, the luxury of making the world less threatening and more intelligible, but it also keeps us locked in and keeps away other ways of seeing the world, other rumors, other possibilities of being capable or accounting ourselves with the world around us. And that's what I want to talk about today, in the form of I don't do critique, I do diffractive readings. So I'm not doing a critique of Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I haven't even completely read the book, but it's possible to discern patterns, a constellation of themes and voices and concerns and philosophies from even a slight reading of that text. For those who don't know this, I doubt that anyone here doesn't, and I heard his wife passed away a few hours ago. She lived to be 104 years old. She was a dancer. This is Joseph Campbell's wife. May her soul rest in peace. So I'm not a mythologist or a traditional storyteller in the ways that my people think of the storyteller. They would slap me upside the head if I presented myself as a storyteller back home in Nigeria. But what I want to do today is to do a diffractive reading of this text and to show, and maybe to help us feel the contours of it, to feel our way through it, and maybe come to a place where we realize that the hero's story needs to be composted. The hero's journey needs to be brought to a place of demise, not by us. It's not going to be any kind of unilateral action we take to plan the demise of this very, very pervasive mythology. But maybe by feeling our way through it, we might touch the traumatic spaces, the erogenous zones of this body. And then we might feel our way through what might want to come next. We might be touched or met by beings that are greater than us, beings that exceed the story. So that's what I want us to do today. That's what I want to share with us today. And I bring this to our collective wisdom, knowing that anything that can be said at all is always going to be spoken in a sense of complementariness, if you will. Exclude other things from being spoken. I'm deeply aware of that. So I do not speak anything as if it is an absolute truth. I speak knowing that my words are fragile. creaturely, earth-based, something to add to the compost heap, not something to deify and monumentalize and put on a statue or the tablets of the Ten Commandments. So I invite us today to dwell with this and to wrestle with it, not in an aim to, or with an aim to defeat it, but to be changed by meeting this story that I want to tell. So here goes. I know some of us here might be movie buffs now that we're in quarantine. For me, it's Lord of the Rings, like I've just said. I wrote an article last year. This is before the COVID-19 phenomenon, about Batman and the Dark Knight, which is another hero's myth as well, a hero's journey. Maybe the point here is, anywhere you look, it seems this idea of the hero's journey is pervasive. It's everywhere. It's in Coco. It's deeply rooted in the American DNA. Speaking as a Nigerian who views the American system and has been educated to learn about the American nation state, it's deeply baked into the American entrepreneurial spirit, for instance, the idea that you can make a life for yourself, that you can wield your agency in a way that marshals capacities and galvanizes skills and creative ways of seeing to create profit, to create movement, to create change. That spirit of gusto. This is what we learned about the American situation. And I hear aspects of that story, and I'll speak little bit about that story in how we're framing collectively, at least the mass media is framing the COVID-19 situation. Right now, about 93 teams from around the world are beginning this journey of descending into cracks to the dragon's lair to meet this villainous being called the virus, which they are attempting to slay. And if they do it right, they will come out with a vaccine and they would give it to the people and everyone will be healed. And then the ordinary will be changed. So it's like, it's a beautiful story of the ordinary inflected through the wonderful, courageous heroism, the quixotic heroism of scientists and nurses and welfare workers and people on the streets doing their darndest, their best to help us recover, to help us get back to the normal. This is the story that is being told about this. And so it's quite pervasive, this Campbellian myth, but a little bit more about the hero's myth. Joseph Campbell, who was a mythologist, a folklorist, called it the monomyth. And it's the idea that there's a universal story. He did what most folklorists and people who study cultures don't usually do. People usually study cultures, look for differences across cultures. He looked for the thing that was the same, the similarities, basically. And what he thought he found was a pattern, the same song, if you will, the same lyrics, maybe not the same lyrics, but the same plot that dances between each culture's notion of the hero, each culture's myth. And so he called this the monomyth, the single story. If I were to frame this in Tolkien-esque ways, it would be that the world has dispersed rings for all cultures, but Joseph Campbell found a ring to bind them all, the one ring of power, to hold all other rings of power in its service. This monomyth is the idea of the universal archetype. So Joseph Campbell did a lot of reading into Carl Jung and Freud, even though many of his peers disagree with his scholarship. That's another tale for another time. But his readings and his scholarship gave birth to the single story, the universal archetype, the one template with which we can see and read all other cultures. And so many people today see the hero's journey as a call to self-development. It passes through a number of stages. I wrote them down because I have no patience to master them. So if you want to hear them, it sounds like this. It's 3 stages that proceeds from departure to initiation to return. That's the basic categorization of the Campbellian hero's journey. It begins with the ordinary world, with us living in modernity, going about our daily lives, doing the things we know how to do, Facebooking, Twittering. I'm not even sure if Twittering is a verb. Well, let's just take it that way. Doing the normal, ordinary things. And then there's a call to adventure. In stories like Lord of the Rings, it's Gandalf walking into the room and then calling Frodo Baggins to take a ring of power and proceed with that ring of power, ultimately to Mordor, where he must throw the ring into the lake of fire. That's where the adventure begins. We receive a call. We're sometimes reluctant to take this call, but that's where the hero is born. That's where the hero's journey begins. And then when this call is heeded, when the call is accepted, a threshold is crossed. So that's the third part. You cross a threshold. And then you meet trials and friends and foes. It's Frodo Baggins and Bilbo Baggins meeting, Gollum. It's meeting the monsters along the way who torture you, who tempt you, who try to pull you away from the highway, and the right hero would make it through that and make it to the 5th stage where you meet the magical mentor, who is Gandalf, telling you, I will see you by daylight. I can't do it as dramatically as that actor did it, but it's the magical mentor teaching you words of wisdom along the way, telling you you can do it, you can make it, you're not ordinary, you're special. The 6th stage is the stage of confrontation. It's Spider-Man meeting a villain. I don't know what Spider-Man's villain is. It's Coco meeting his uncle, right? Did I get it right? Because I watched Coco a long time ago with my daughter. It's Coco finding out that his uncle is actually the villain and not his revered mentor after all. It's a dragon's lair where for men, according to Campbell, you enter into a mother's complex. For Campbell, you see, the greatest hindrance to men was retreating back into the womb. And so he felt that was the greatest challenge that men need to face, the heroes need to face in order to be truly heroic men. If you ask where women are in this picture, Campbell didn't quite think of women as heroes. Women were supposed to be the prizes to be won, not to be the heroes, according to Joseph Campbell, which is one of the reasons why I find it problematic, because in my culture, we have many heroes that are women. The 7th stage is the moment of despair. You find out that maybe you're not good enough. Maybe Neo in the Matrix isn't the one. Maybe you're not cut out for this. And so you give up. But in that moment of giving up, you come to the 8th stage. You're given the ultimate treasure. You win after all. You find out that you've actually transcended. You're actually the one, and you've always been the one. You can stop bullets in midair. You found the vaccine that could cure the virus, cure us of the COVID-19 disease. You're good. You're faithful. You're right. You're the hero. You've won. And now in the 9th stage, you're homeward bound. You come back out into the surface, and not just the same way you left when you descended. You're different this time. You've changed. You're no longer Gandalf the Grey. You're now Gandalf the White. You've fought with the demons and you've transcended and you've won. And you've come back with the golden fleece. And the 10th and the final stage is rebirth and the champion's return. So there are also challenges there, according to Campbell. You don't just return. You have to know what to do with your new circumstance. What do we do with the vaccine when we find it? Who do we give it to first? Which nations get to share it first? So there's a lot happening here with the hero's journey and the hero's myth. Now we get to the part where it becomes problematic because, like I said, and I'm not the only one saying this, many of Campbell's peers still today still find his views on culture deeply problematic. For one reason, of course, is how the idea of the universal erases differences. By saying that it's all the same. Another way people say that today is we're all one. We're all one. Forget our differences. You're erasing my specificity. You're erasing my embeddedness in my situation, in my culture, in my lands. You're erasing the histories of my bodies. And I say bodies, not body, because my people, for instance, see ourselves as plural. We're not to be reduced to an individual with a separate enclosed psyche that is removed traumatically, dissociated from ecology. We are something of a collective presence without descending into a hive mind of sci-fi tropes. We are us, Ubuntu. So Campbell's myth-making practices, especially the hero's journey, erases differences. It erases the contributions of other people, other cultures across the world. You might think it honors them by bringing them together when it actually treats them as disruptions. It tries to look past them to an algorithm behind them and says, they don't matter. This is the gist of the matter. This is the ingredient that we need here. And that is why I find it personally so problematic. It doesn't look at me. It doesn't see me. It may have the same lyrics and plots, but that doesn't mean it's the same thing. The way we tell the story of the tortoise and the hare, in a race together, is different from the way it's told in the West. And they might have the same lines and the same sentiments, but deeply embedded in Yoruba culture, for instance, in my culture, it has totally different invitations, totally different nuances that are not caught in a universal theory of everything. So here's what I want to add to that as well. Remember what I said starting out, that stories do not only teach us how to see, stories are also ways blind spots are proliferated. Stories are ways we become blind. Just like seeing is the politics of being blind. Seeing is not just a way of representing a visual world. Seeing is a way of falling into traps of perception, habits of perception. Seeing is always political. It's the same way stories are political. They're ecological, spiritual, theological, gastronomical, biological, virtual ways of molding the universe into what we would like it to be, into what we are comfortable with. And most of the time, that tends to just reflect what we want to see back to us. And then the insurgency of the invisible is diminished. All the other aspects of story that want to be seen, all the other aspects of the world that want to be known, that want to share with us, are shut out because we have no way of noticing them or representing them. We have no words. If I were to invite everyone here now to think of a new color, just think of a new color that is not on the spectrum. We have no means to do that because we have no experience with that. That's the same thing that happens with the Campbellian hero's journey, with that template. It claims to be the spectrum, and then it invisibilizes backgrounds, excludes other stories from being told. So stories are subsidized by things they invisibilize. Stories are subsidized by things they make invisible. What is, what subsidizes the hero's journey? I ask this question in this way because I feel that part of what we are being invited to today, I've been speaking about fugitivity for some time. I write a lot and speak a lot about the transatlantic slave trade and the plantation and the dynamics of fugitivity and how it invites us to form other places of power, even in places of power that we're used to. It kind of invites us to carve out a different way of being in the world, even when we're being under some colonial powers. So what I want to do with this right now is ask this question: what subsidizes the hero's journey? What are we missing by seeing only the hero's straight and narrow highway from descent to emergence, from separation to reunion with the home front? The first is what I call chronos. Chronos for me is time, but not just time, universal, empty, homogeneous, modern time. Campbell presumed that time moves forward, that the hero's journey proceeds from past to future, and then assumed that every story and every myth around the world will fit this template. What he missed is that there are other senses of temporality and time that are afoot, that are alive in how we meet the world. So kairos is missing from chronos, is missing from the hero's journey. And kairos is this idea of intersections, of crossroads meeting each other. Someone calls it the kairotic entanglement. So chronos is straight and linear time, but kairos is messy, mangled, slushy time, where the past is yet to come and the future has already happened. For instance, in my culture, we speak about the trickster. I don't know if you guys, I know that there are tricksters in America, there are tricksters across the planet. I know of the coyote, I know of the raven. We have a very, very ambiguous, indeterminate figure called Eshu. Eshu is worshipped in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Argentina, in Brazil, in the Caribbean. Eshu, there's a poem that we say about him that he throws a stone today and kills 3 birds yesterday. And we say that, because we understand time to mean something entirely different. Time doesn't move forward. How dare you say that? That's a rude reduction of time's majesty. It doesn't move forward in some linear, coherent way. Ancestors are just as present right now. The hero's journey proceeding from this stage to this stage is just a modern continuum that doesn't pay attention to the ways that the past still lingers, in a way that the past is still very much present, so that you might think you've achieved a stage, but you're still in hell, if you will. So we have many stories that talk about people being in some places that they think that they're not in, and they find out through some magical means that they never left a place that they thought they left behind. I don't know if I'm making sense. Can't recall all those stories right now, but it's quite obvious to us that Chronos is just a tiny provincial aspect of Kairos. Another thing that subsidizes, that is invisibilized by the hero's journey, is what I call Helios, or the Campbellian notion of emergence, of arrival. Helios is the Greek word for sun. And it's not just a Campbellian myth, it's quite pervasive in modernity today. We otherize darkness. We see the dark as the other of light, as the enemy of light. So we conquer darkness and then we gain more light. It's the way we are making an enemy of the virus at the moment. If we win the virus, if we win over the virus, if we claim victory, then we might reemerge, and get back to the normal. The thing about vaccines is that vaccines proliferate monsters unknown to many people. Vaccines don't restore us to normal. There's no immunization that makes us get back to some kind of normal state. The vaccination is literally the reintroduction of the monster back into your body so that your body is made into some chimeric ecology that accepts the monster as part of its being. And that's I don't want to go into virology now, but that's what some virologists call attenuated viruses. So they take a bit of the virus and they insert it, and that is supposed to proliferate antibodies that makes up the very process of immunity. So vaccination is not a restoration to normality. It's high praise for your monstrosity. It's high praise for the fact that you have never been normal. So Helios in the Campbellian myth is the idea that we are only good in the light, that we're creatures of the light. It pays no attention to the fact that the darkness has its own imperatives. Darkness is not just a place where light, that's just an adaptive response to light. It's a secondary version of light waiting to realize itself. Darkness, the deep, has its own imperatives. Last year, or I think 2 years ago, December 2018, scientists discovered what they now call a deep biosphere. And what they found out in the deep biosphere is billions of life forms that they had never discovered before, that supersede the life forms that exist on the surface. That is, there's another world, there's another universe that lives under our feet, living in the dark, living without sunlight. They live there, they thrive there, they eat there, they do things there, they have their own politics, they have their own theologies, they have their own spiritualities. That teaches me that darkness is not just it's not vestigial. It's not instrumental. It's not a utilitarian means to get back to the light in the ways that we say, for instance, the light at the end of the tunnel. I think there's a place for sitting with the darkness. I think there's a place for staying with the darkness, staying with the trouble, and being composted in the magic of the darkness. A lot of things are rushing in my very exhausted brain right now. Things that have to do with physics and diffraction, and how the dual slit experiment actually shows that light needs darkness to be fully itself. And darkness needs light to be fully itself. So that if you were to try to separate light from darkness, you would end up without any of them. So Helios is the regime of light that pays no attention, pays no mind, does not acknowledge the gifts and the contribution of darkness to how the world continues to unfold. The third aspect, or the third thing that I feel is privileged in this Campbellian myth is the idea of the anthropos, man, the self, the psyche. The reason I have a lot of discomfort with the hero's journey is that it privileges human beings as central to how the world matters. The self is this coherent, essential thing that travels through a journey, materializes in one form and dematerializes and comes up again. We have no room for noticing how the world around us actually matters, how we've never been separate from ecology, how we've never been separate from furniture, computers, virtuality. And I mean that. Let me tell you a story from a book called Epistemic Situationism. It's one of those academic words that infuriates, but they mean well. Epistemic situationism tells the story of psychologists. I'm a trained psychologist. I'm recovering from all my training. Don't worry. But my colleagues did a series of experiments that demonstrated that we are not quite as independent as we think we are. So if I were to ask you a question, and you don't need to answer this, just think about this. If you were to think about nominating someone to the Supreme Court, what qualities or virtues or characteristics, personality traits would you look for in a person that you're about to nominate to the Supreme Court? Well, these psychologists asked the same question, and they had their own list as well. But what they found out was deeply disturbing. They found out that the furniture that judges sit on, tables, the hardness of the table, the softness of the chair in which they sit, of the chairs in which they sit, have surprising effects on how they make judgments. They found out that judges were more resilient or more relaxed and lenient when their furniture was soft. And when their furniture was made of hard wood, they dished out harsh punishments to those who stood before them, which disturbs the idea that those characteristics are inherent, they're part of the individual, removed from any other situational or situated circumstances around the person. Those characteristics are part of what makes this person who he or she is. What these experiments are telling us, and they're still ongoing, is that that we are the entanglement between furniture, between virtuality, between the food we ate in the morning, between breakfast, between, streams of stories that are flying in the air, between microbial activisms in our gut. So much so that some psychologists are beginning to speak about, not beginning, they've been doing this for some time, the second brain, the gut brain. That is, you think that your appetites, your moods are entirely yours. No, they're not. They are the secretions of bacteria and viruses in your belly and in your body, which is another interesting fact about viruses, that they make up part of our DNA, so that to frame the virus as an enemy is to mount an insurgency against yourself. So this story of epistemic situationism disturbs the account of human separation or separability. We've never been separate from ecology. We've never been separate from the things around us. Just right now, wherever you are, in the chair that you're sitting, maybe if you've had breakfast, maybe you've had a cereal. Sorry, I'm thinking breakfast because it's morning for me. I guess it's evening for you guys, but it's 6:47 a.m. in the morning here in India. That's why I'm thinking so much about breakfast and cereal. All of that is part of the constellation that makes us who we are. So that to perpetuate the myth of the human that is separate, totally separate in the notion of the self, in the notion of consciousness, in the notion of attributes, in the notion of agency, capacity, capability, from the rest of the planet, is to mount up an ethical project that is increasingly problematic in the age of the Anthropocene. when we're being invited to see that we are part of the world and not transcendent, not lords of the realm, transcendent over it. So I call that the anthropos, the man that needs to be composted and needs to meet its demise. The etymological root of the word demise is not death in its finality, it is the exchange of property. That is the transference of property. That's what demise means, etymologically speaking. That is literally, we're saying to the world around us, you're not just mute and dead and resources that are meant to be converted to our economy. You're alive, you're vital, you matter by your own selves, whether we're in the picture or not. And that is a surprising thing to say and a shocking thing to say for us gestating in modern settlements. The final thing that is very paramount in and privileged in the Campbellian framework of the hero's journey, of the monomyth, is Narcissus, what I call Narcissus. And I think everyone knows the story of the hunter and the tragic hero of Greek fame that was so handsome that he fell in love with his own reflection in the river and died there and did not return the love of Echo, I think, who died and became a flower or something. I can't remember the whole thing, but I very well remember narcissistic personality disorder and my training in clinical frameworks. Narcissus is the paradigm of reflexivity. It's the paradigm of representationalism. When we build human skill environments, when we build environments that only reflect the human back to us, then we're caught in a bind. Then we don't know how to think like worms or trees or mountains. We don't know how to think like the vulture, who thinks of death not as a final bus stop, but as a as a portal to other ways of being embodied, as midwifing the next. And so Narcissus, Chronos, Helios, and Anthropos seem to me to be very strong elders in the Campbellian myth. And they're disturbing because they keep us from meeting the world in its agency. So the issue isn't how do we get rid of this monomyth of Campbell's? It's how do we touch it? What we're doing, and I think what we're being invited today as peoples across the planet, in all our embodied and surprising and magical differences, is to meet ourselves as if for the first time. And this demands and this calls for new ways of being with the world. But we cannot do that unilaterally. I've heard of people speak about us creating a new story. Let's just come together and write a new story about humanity, about the next. And I remember giving a keynote in Germany 4 years ago in Berlin. And after the speech, there was this exercise that the hosts did. And everyone came together. And what they were facilitating was contributions about the old paradigm. They called it the old paradigm and the new paradigm. And so they got this whiteboard and they invited people to populate each section of the whiteboard. On the left was the old paradigm, and people stood up and said ageism, sexism, racism, ecocide, things that they didn't like, and they listed them. And they were invited to do the same for the new paradigm, and they said all the things that we like to hear: abundance, feminism, and all the good things that we talk about today: gift, community, integrity. And I stood up And I was invited to write something on board, my own list, my own stuff, my own contribution. And I put a question mark in between the line. And I went back to sit. And the question mark between the line was disturbing for everyone because I was calling into question the hasty demarcation of the old from the new. That all of this is old, we're rushing into the new. As a creature and as a subject of the so-called global South, I know all too well about the good intentions of the West and the messianic saviorism of people who come into communities and say, we know what's coming next. This is what wants to happen. And we want to save you. So here's a laptop for you. Every laptop for every child in this village. Or we're going to teach you how to recycle. And by recycling, you guys will be healthy. And that's one part of the story. But another part of the story is that the entire recycling economy of the globalized West depends on the misery of the South. It literally ships off billions of tons to places like Ghana and Nigeria and dumps them. Computers that you no longer use, things that you thought you safely recycled that reinforced your sense of righteousness, dumped in my playgrounds. And then that's where I learned how to play. And that's where people around us learned how to play. So I know all too well the desire to rush into the new, especially now with everything seemingly paused, the entire world seemingly brought to a standstill. Everyone wants to think about the next manifesto for the next new bright and brilliant society. And this rush into the next perpetuates a cycle, a repetitive cycle of misery. So that, again, I feel we're being called to slow down. And this is the reason why I say that times are urgent. Let us slow down. The slowing down is not to reduce our speed in getting there. Practice a little yoga once in a while, reinforce our sense of spiritual grounding, but still continue on the same path that we're used to. The slowing down is a meeting of worlds that we're not comfortable with. It's to be met by beings that we don't know how to name. And to do that is to come to a place of touching the traumatic, touching the shadows. Campbell doesn't know how to frame that because Campbell guarantees that you'll come out intact, that you will emerge the hero. You come out decorated. So it's just a compliment to what you were before. And not that I want to frame the COVID-19 situation as in some universal, essential way, as if I have the story of what's happening. My ways of seeing are embodied. My ways of knowing are embodied in where I am and who I've been shaped to be by my elders and my situations and my yearnings and my hopes. It's a strategy. Every form of knowing is a strategy. And I feel this strategy is an invitation to us, as many people that I can talk with and speak with. And maybe this time is a time of dwelling with the darkness, sitting with the darkness. There's a word I like to use the most, and I'll soon wrap things up so that we can have some space to speak with each other. It's called katsuluni, katsuluni. And it comes from the Inuit people in some parts of Alaska and some parts of Canada. They have a whaling tradition. That before they go hunting for whales, because whales are not just food for them, they're beings. So they want to come up with a song to sing to the whales. Beautiful tradition. But they don't just come up with songs, right? Here's the part that I feel that is instructive for most of us. They don't just come up with a song unilaterally. What they do is they go into a dark place, a very dark place, and they sit with each other. They don't know what wants to happen. They don't know what might yet happen. They just sit with each other in the darkness. And in the darkness, they observe moments of silence. And sometimes they would break out of the silence to tell stories of their daughters and their sons and their parents. They will whisper beautiful things to themselves. And it's through the dance, the waltzing of silence and words and sentiments and dreams that the lyrics of a new song would emerge. You know, through the cat's cradling weave of bodies and darkness. And so the word Katsulini is what they named this event. And it literally means sitting in the dark and waiting for something to happen. Sitting in the dark and waiting for something to burst forth. Sitting in the dark and waiting for something to break through. And this is the rite of passage I feel we're all being invited today. There are two ways I feel one could respond to a question. One is to offer a resolution, an answer, whether negative or positive, is to seek closure. Modernity is a paradigm of closure. It seeks closure. It seeks categorizations. It says Heather is white and I'm black. But it doesn't know what to do with the fact that we are diffractively spread out across these categories, these tiny categories of white versus black. It doesn't know what to do with a DNA test that says Heather might be 3/4 black, you know, if she does an ancestry test. It doesn't know what to do with that. It just gives you a box and tells you to tick the box. It gives you a logo. It tells you it's Versace. And it says, this is a beautiful bag. Don't ask me a question about how this leather came to be. Don't ask me about the lives that were lost in Congo to get this leather all across, you know, the Atlantic to you. Don't ask me any questions about that. Just realize that this is a quality hand-woven bag and it's called Versace. So modernity is the system of surfaces. To get beyond modernity, we have to go into the depths, into the places that Campbell would like us to emerge from, you know, or just rush through, because where we ought to be is to dwell in the light. So we're being invited into Katsulunis, if you will, places of shadow, places of ancestry making, places of knowing that grieving is part of storytelling. The words and the lyrics and the plots for what wants to happen is not entirely up to us to form, to make. Because we're not in the world by ourselves. We are in the world only as a result of the gifts and the contributions of microbes and furniture and handsets and laptops around us. We show up because of the manifold. And it is the manifold that will create the new story. So I want to end with a story then. And this story is something I tell over and over again, and I tell it as a metaphor or a figure of things to come, as a prophecy. And by prophecy, I don't mean a prediction. I mean a place that is thickened, a now that is thickened, a now that is curdling, a now that is ontologically expanding and inviting us to play with it in new hybrid forms of making bodies and seeking out new kin. I feel, and just before I tell this story, I feel that the urgent requirement of our time is not to, as I was saying before, offer a resolution, a new story that resolves the crisis of the COVID-19 phenomenon or climate change or whatever civilizational crisis we're dealing with. I feel that something more than a resolution wants to happen, and that's a rite of passage. That's a ritual. A rite of passage is something that doesn't leave us the same way, and that's different from the hero's journey. A rite of passage acknowledges the brilliant vibrancy and agency of darkness. And it also does not centralize the hero. It centralizes the manifold, all the collectives that come together to make a moment, which is the reason why in Africa, one does not just become a man or a woman. You go through a rite of passage. My people endure facial scarification, which I was educated to think was horrible and ugly. I'm decolonizing myself from that sentiment. It's still an ongoing project. But facial scarification was a way of saying, keep the trauma close by. Never forget that the world is called into being by a trick, by a libation, by a sacrifice, by a cutting of the flesh. That you're never going to be fully complete by yourself. Give away part of yourself to the world. And so you take a bit of your flesh and you give it to the planet, to the world. In some parts of Nigeria, you have to jump over a herd of cattle, a herd of cows, jump over cows. And if you land safely on the other side, if you do land safely on the other side, jumping on their backs, then you're now a man. In the nation Vanuatu, there's the precursor to the bungee jumping tradition, which was taken to New Zealand, I think, by a man called A.J. Hackett. The precursor is called Nagol, and it literally requires men to tie themselves up to a 90-foot rickety scaffolded structure, and then hurl themselves from the top of this structure to the ground without safety nets, without any of those things in place, and come so close to the earth that they say that your shoulder kisses the ground. And one of the things that they say is that when your shoulder kisses the ground, it blesses the earth, and you are blessed in return. And this became bungee jumping without all the cultural stuff. It's just done for entertainment with helmets and safety nets and stuff and ropes that spring you back up. These guys had no ropes. They had vines, and some died in the course of that. Why go through rituals that might kill you? It's because there's a sense of death that is not the opposite of life from many indigenous cultures. Life-death ecologies, where life is not the opposite of death, but the intimate requirement for death to be fully itself. And these cultures know how to make into technology this idea that we need to dwell in the liminal spaces. We need to remember and continue to reconfigure ourselves over and over again. We need to shapeshift. That is almost impossible for a modern citizen to do. Because once you have your passport, that's what you are. Once you have your identity, you have no means to change that. That's all there is. Then what hope is there for us to meet the world anew? What hope is there for us to construct new paradigms? So this is a story then. Let me end with a story that I've been promising to tell you. I was in Brazil in 2017, and I was traveling and touring and speaking about my book that I just written called These Wilds Beyond Our Fences. And my hosts took me through a slum, the favela, which is a remarkable experience. I've gone back many times since. And in this favela, I was taken through this beautiful carved out room where children were making rag dolls, and they were being facilitated by a teacher, by a couple of adults. And I sat with some of them, talked about what they were doing. And as I was leaving, one of the teachers held my hand and dragged me backward. And I'm so grateful that she did that, because she showed me one of the rag dolls, which was a black rag doll, just, it wasn't exciting to me. It was a rag doll. Yeah, there it is. And she said, do you know what this is? And I said, it's a rag doll. And she says, no, do you know what it's called? And I said, does it have a special name that I don't know of? And she said, it's called Abayomi, which was so exciting to me. And my hair stood on, stood on the back of my neck. And I was like, Abayomi? Are you kidding me? Are you serious about that now? And she said, yes, it's called Abayomi. Now, the reason why I was so surprised about that is because my father's name is Abayomi and my son's name is Abayomi. And so it was such a powerful moment. And I asked, why call it Abayomi? It's a Yoruba name. And I know that Yoruba people were transported across the Atlantic and they are a major part of the Afro-Brazilian culture today, the Creolized part of that nation. But they told me a story about how that name came to be. There's a legend of a woman who endured that trip across the Atlantic. Many of you might know that many people gave birth in those slave ships. They, along the way, or already had their babies embarking on that trip. And I cannot imagine a more miserable circumstance than to not just be on a slave ship, which is some form of a spaceship if you're really thinking about it, but to be there with one's child, with a baby, and try to console that child. The legend has it that this woman was trying her best to maybe comfort her child, but nothing was happening. And then suddenly Eshu, the trickster that I just told you about, whispered to this woman what to do. And she took a bit of her cloth, which is this black material, and she weaved a rag doll out of it. She kind of contrived a rag doll. And that worked, at least for a moment, because the child was temporarily comforted. And she named that rag doll Abayomi. And the meaning of the name Abayomi is, they thought they buried me, but they did not realize I'm a seed. It also means sorry, every time I remember this story, it also means that the enemy would have defeated me, but God came to my rescue. And I like the idea of power in defeat, that there are places in this world where power masquerades as defeat. It hides underneath the garbs of the slave. And it works its own rite of passage. Many elders today say that Eshu actually brought the slave ships to Africa because he wanted, as horrific and as traumatic as that sounds, and as unjustifiable as that sounds, he wanted a rite of passage. He wanted to travel. He wanted a new way of seeing the world. And he wanted a new way of diffracting the notion of blackness. There's a whole thing to be said about that, but I'll just leave with that. That this woman held her child and she found hope in the belly of hopelessness. She found a place, it was almost like a smile in Auschwitz, like just a twinkle in an eye that says, you're still alive, you're still human, even in this most dehumanizing of circumstances, you're still powerful. And that even as my back is whipped open by the slave master, I know that as my blood gushes forth, it undoes not just me, but the slave master himself. And that we're undoing each other in this moment, so that my defeat is not entire and your victory is indeterminate, is never certain. The story of climate change and the COVID-19 phenomenon is hastily, and this is a summary, I guess, is hastily framed as us potentially surmounting the challenge of this virulent invader. What if there are other ways of meeting this crisis? What if there's power in our social distancing methodologies? What if instead of just making do, we can make sanctuary? Oh, maybe let me put it this way. What if instead of just making do, we can make do? We can make shit. We can make compost together and meet ourselves as if for the first time. What if the work of framing new stories is an intergenerational project that requires our failure? That is not hinged on how woke we are, how aware we are, how alive we are, how learned we are, but still enlists us in partial ways, in modest ways, to weave itself into being. What if even those that we frame now as enemies, potentially, possibly radically stupid for not accepting the official doctrines of the official account of the virus? What if even their failure is part of something big that we don't know how to speak to yet? And what if in meeting the monster, there are other ways to behave in front of it other than trying to dismantle it? What if we can prostrate and offer our bodies as libations in fugitive networks of rekindling our entanglement with the planet? That's my story, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Bayo, thank you. Thank you so much for this, the richness and the depth and your generous way of being in a state of wonder in these times and making such space for the life and the mystery. Just really, really appreciate the depth to also attending to our, why we are all coming is to be students of story. And what does it mean to be students of story in our time and to be conscious creators? You know, one of the pieces that you spoke that really struck me was, that landed in me was the, I'll be dramatic, the tragedy of having the hero's journey forced upon our culture. And that it is now so idealized that you almost can't find a story that comes out of our time that doesn't follow that, because it's been, I love what you said, it's that story has, it's hijacked our systems. It's like, it's what we know. And I'm reading a book by Leslie Mormon Silko right now, and she brings alive the stories, carries the stories of the Pueblo and the Laguna people. And her stories are a little bit like what you spoke to, which is they don't end, they don't end well. You know? They don't end easily. There's nothing that's tightened up, and I feel each time my system of story gets like expanded and challenged, because it's this new way of being alive in story starts to take root every time I take in these kinds of other stories, you know, where it becomes, makes more space for me to be alive in the truth of the emergent story that wants to come through this time. And it creates this like little escape trap from this hero's journey that so many of us are stuck within. So I take that away. Thank you so much. Bayo, thank you so very much.
Thank you. We Katsiluni's together.
Yes. You fed us well. You fed us well, good man. Thank you.